Stepping on the Cracks by Mary Downing Hahn, Chapter 11. The next week, Mrs. Wagner kept us busy, but the following Saturday, Elizabeth burst into my room and thrust a sheet of paper at me. "Read this, and tell me what you think," she said. In scrawling penmanship, Elizabeth had written, "Dear Gordy, we know you are hiding a dirty, coward deserter in your hut. We also know who he is, your yellow brother Stuart. Maybe we'll tell, maybe we won't. That's for us to know and you to find out. Suspensefully yours, 2 anonymous enemies. P.S. You stink." "Well, what do you think?" Elizabeth perched on the foot of the bed, grinning. Didn't I do a good job of disguising my handwriting? I bet even Mrs. Wagner wouldn't recognize it. It did indeed look amazingly sloppy, large, and loopy, and slanting backward instead of forward. "I wrote with my left hand," Elizabeth confessed. "I was going to write more, but it took so long I got tired of it." "You spelled anonymous wrong," I told her. Elizabeth shrugged. "Who cares? I'm not getting a grade on it." "If we don't sign our names, how can we blackmail Gordy into being nice?" I asked. "Oh, this is just the first letter," Elizabeth said. "We'll let him worry for a week, and then we'll reveal our true identities." Though I didn't dare say it, I thought Elizabeth had been listening to too many radio shows. She sounded like one of the Shadow's enemies. Looking at her sprawled on my bed, rereading her letter, it occurred to me she was the first girl I'd ever known who might grow up to be a criminal. After lunch, Elizabeth and I set out to deliver Gordy's letter. I wanted to send it through the regular mail. I even offered to pay for the stamp, but Elizabeth insisted on hand-carrying it to his house. "What if he sees us?" I asked her as we crept along behind the sagging fence bordering Gordy's yard. "He won't," she said, with a lot more confidence than I felt. "How about his father?" I asked. In some ways, I was more scared of Mr. Smith than I was of Gordy. "Quit worrying, Margaret," Elizabeth said. "I know what I'm doing." Crouching even lower, she peered through the fence at Gordy's house. At first glance, it seemed almost identical to the shingled bungalows on Garfield Road. But, unlike them, its paint was worn to a dingy gray. The front door was scuffed and scarred. An old refrigerator stood on the porch, and one of the windows was covered with cardboard. In the yard, a broken swing dangled from the tree, and a couple of tricycles and a scooter lay on their sides in the dirt. I saw Gordy's wagon, but I didn't see his bicycle. "Do you think he's home?" I whispered. Elizabeth shook her head. "Let's watch the house for a while to make sure." We squatted for so long my knees ached, but nothing happened. No one came, no one left. A thin stream of smoke rose from the chimney and drifted away on the wind. The swing's rope twisted and untwisted, and its broken seat clacked against the tree trunk. The longer I stared at the dark windows, at the paint peeling away from the sills, at the naked baby doll lying on its back on the porch, the sadder the house looked. After a while, a thin gray cat crept up the steps and sat down by the door. Its ears perked hopefully. When the door stayed shut, the cat hunkered down and tucked its paws under its chest. Closing its eyes, it dozed at its post. Elizabeth smoothed Gordy's envelope. "Do you dare me to put this in the mail slot?" I nodded, knowing she wanted me to encourage her. Elizabeth looked up the street and down. No one was in sight. She leapt to her feet and ran up to the sidewalk. Thrusting the letter through the mail slot, she thumped on the door and dashed back again. "Come on!" I was already running as fast as I could, heart thumping, feet pounding, gasping for breath. We raced around the corner and headed for home. "Did anyone see us?" Elizabeth asked me after we'd gone to my room and slammed the door. "Just the cat," I said. "You sure scared him. I never saw a cat disappear so fast." We laughed then, just thinking about Gordy's cat. But later, after Elizabeth's mother called her home for dinner, it didn't seem so funny. Not just the cat, but the whole thing. Monday, we'd have to go to school and see Gordy. Even though we had the goods on him, as Elizabeth said, I was scared of what he might do. A week passed without anything happening. Sometimes I thought Gordy was watching Elizabeth and me, but he didn't say a word to either of us, or anybody else for that matter. In fact, he spent most of the day with his head on his desk. He didn't cut up in class or cause trouble on the playground. Mrs. Wagner didn't keep him after school. Once she asked him if he was sick, but he just shook his head and stared at the floor. If I'd liked him, I would have been worried about him. The next Saturday, Elizabeth and I were sitting in our tree, talking. "I think our note scared Gordy pretty bad," Elizabeth said. He hasn't said boo to anyone all week." For a few moments, she sat quietly, swinging one foot and frowning. The sun shone through her hair, changing it into a cloud of silver. I watched her warily, wondering what she was thinking about. "Let's go down to the hut again and see what's going on," she said. "Do we have to?" I asked. But she was already on the ground, running toward the train tracks. Reluctantly, I swung down from the safety of our tree and ran after her. Following our usual procedure, we crept close enough to see the hut. Except for a tiny trace of smoke from the chimney, the place looked deserted. No voices, no movement, no sound came from behind the closed door. "I'll sneak up and look in the window," Elizabeth whispered. "You stay here and watch for Gordy." "Be careful," I told Elizabeth, but she was already crawling toward the hut. Nervously, I watched her cross the clearing on her hands and knees. When she was below the window, she rose slowly to her feet, and, while I held my breath, she peered inside. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Elizabeth didn't move. I didn't move. The squirrel who had hopped into the clearing behind Elizabeth didn't move. We were all motionless as statues. Then the woods behind me exploded with noise. Before I could shout a warning, Doug grabbed me, and Gordy was going after Elizabeth. She fought like a cat, furious, all fingernails and teeth, but she couldn't get away from him. As we struggled, the hut's door opened and Stuart ran outside. "Hey," he shouted, "what's going on? Let those girls go before you hurt them." But Gordy and Doug ignored him. Shoving past Stuart, they dragged Elizabeth and me into the hut. Stuart followed us, and Gordy kicked the door shut, blocking it with his body. He let go of Elizabeth. "You sent that letter, didn't you?" Gordy yelled. His face was white, and the scar over his eyebrow was purple. Quicker to recover than I was, Elizabeth glared at him. "So what if I did?" she panted, still breathing hard. "Who else have you told?" "That's for me to know and you to find out." She folded her arms across her chest and tipped her chin up. "Didn't I tell you not to come down here?" Gordy yelled. "Didn't I warn you to stay out of the woods?" "You aren't the boss of me," Elizabeth said, "and you don't own these woods." "Hold on, Gordy." Stuart pulled his brother away from Elizabeth. "Leave her be. She's only a girl." Nothing made Elizabeth madder than being called a girl. She clenched her fists and stared at Stuart, but he just laughed at her. "Aren't you Joe Crawford's little sister?" he asked. "Don't you dare even speak my brother's name, you dirty deserter," Elizabeth said. "Joe's fighting the Japs right now. He's not hiding out in the woods letting other people die for our country." Stuart stopped smiling then, and Elizabeth pointed at me. "Margaret's brother's in the war too." "I know," Stuart said. "So's my brother Donald." "So how come you're not?" Elizabeth yelled. Gordy grabbed Elizabeth and whirled her around so she was facing him. "You better not tell anybody about Stuart," he said. "Why shouldn't I?" Elizabeth asked. "It's against the law to hide a deserter." Gordy ran a hand through his hair, pushing it back from his forehead so it stood up like grass for a minute. Darting a look at Doug, he shoved his hand in his pockets and scowled at Elizabeth. "Do you know what happens to deserters?" Gordy asked. For once, he didn't yell. Instead, he leaned toward Elizabeth, almost like he was begging. "Stuart could be shot, or put in jail, or sent straight to the front. Some Nazi would kill him on the first day. Do you want that to happen to him?" "Huh," Elizabeth said. "It would serve him right." She flicked her eyes at Stuart. "I don't feel sorry for him. Not one bit. I'd rather see him die than Joe." She turned to me. "How about you, Margaret? Wouldn't you be mad if Jimmy died and old sissy baby Stuart was right here, safe in the woods?" Without wanting to, I looked at Stuart. His long, dark hair hid most of his face, but I could see how thin he was. Like me, he was all elbows and knees and wrist bones. How could I wish him dead? I didn't want anybody to die. Not Jimmy, not Joe, not Stuart. I just wanted the war to be over. When I didn't say anything, Stuart said, "There's been too much killing already. Even if they catch me and send me overseas, I won't shoot anybody. War's wrong." "Tell Hitler about it," Elizabeth said scornfully. "He started it, not us. Him and the Japs. If we don't kill them, they'll kill us. Is that what you want?" "Of course not," Stuart said. His voice faltered, and he coughed. Running his hands through his hair, he looked at all of us. His face was very pale. "It's so complicated. I can't explain it. Killing's wrong. Wrong of them, wrong of us. I know it." Stuart stared at Elizabeth and me as if he had hoped we'd understand what he meant, but we didn't say anything. As Elizabeth said, America hadn't started the war. Like it or not, we had to stop Hitler. Everybody knew that. Look, Stuart tried again. The Germans and the Japs and the Italians are all people, right? Just like us. They have mothers and fathers. They have wives. They have little kids. They don't want to kill me any more than I want to kill them. They just want to live their lives and let me live mine. You know, tell a few jokes, sit in the sun, eat dinner, go for a walk, stuff like that. Same as us. Elizabeth turned to me. You were right after all, Margaret. There really is a crazy man in the woods. Stuart shoved his hands deep in his pockets and lowered his head. He looked so confused and unhappy I couldn't help feeling sorry for him. I glanced at Gordy to see if he understood what Stuart was trying to say, but he was leaning against the door, scowling at the ground and shaking his head. He didn't agree with Stuart any more than Elizabeth did. You're just a sissy, Elizabeth scowled at Stuart. Like my brother always said you were, isn't he, Margaret? Since Elizabeth expected me to agree with her, I nodded, but I felt as if a crack had opened in the solid earth under my feet. When Jimmy was drafted, I'd never thought to ask him how he felt about going to war. Until now, it hadn't occurred to me that he might not want to kill anyone. In fact, I'd never really thought about his pointing a gun at a human being and pulling the trigger. How could Jimmy do that? How could anyone? Silence filled the hut, sucking in the air, suffocating us. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. Outside, the wind rattled the treetops and sneaked through the cracks between the boards. Its cold currents circled our ankles, and crept down our necks. Like a noise off stage, a train blew its whistle for the Calvert Road crossing. Once, twice, 3 times, getting louder each time. When the engine thundered past, it drowned out the sound of the wind and shook the hut's walls. I studied Stuart's pale face and tried to understand. Was war something you could walk away from like a fight on the playground? Shivering in the cold, I wished Jimmy was here so I could ask him what he thought. If anyone could explain, he could. My brother knew everything. Chapter 12. In the quiet the train left behind, Gordy looked at Elizabeth and me. Promise you won't tell, he said. Stuart can't fight. He never could. He'd be a lousy soldier. Stuart glanced at his brother. How many times do I have to tell you? Fighting's not everything, Gordy. Ignoring Stuart, Gordy kept his eyes on Elizabeth and me, waiting for us to speak. Elizabeth tilted her head and peered at Gordy through a tangle of hair. What's it worth to you for us to keep our mouths shut? Gordy and Doug exchanged looks. We'll leave you alone, Gordy said. We'll quit picking on you. How about those boards you stole from us? Elizabeth asked. How about our treehouse? We'll build you another one, Gordy muttered. Better than that crummy thing you had. So what do you think, Margaret? Elizabeth asked. Sounds okay to me, I said. All I really wanted to do was get out of that hut and go home. I'd have agreed to anything just to escape. I didn't want to hear another word from Stuart. I didn't want to look at his sad face. Most of all, I didn't want to feel sorry for him. All right, Elizabeth said to Gordy, but you better build us the best treehouse in College Hill. Promise not to say anything about Stuart, Gordy glared at us, but he was beaten. He knew it, and we knew it. Cross my heart and hope to die, if I ever tell a lie, we said. Now get out of here, Gordy said, and a little bit of the old menace creeping into his voice, and don't come back. He stepped aside and opened the door. Elizabeth walked out first, but I hesitated. Stuart was coughing. It sounded deep and loose, like it was coming from way down in his chest. Is he all right? I asked Gordy. Scram, magpie, Gordy said. I can take care of Stuart. I don't need any stupid girls hanging around. He looked out the door at Elizabeth. You too, lizard, he shouted. Get lost, both of you. Without looking back, Elizabeth and I raced for home. When we were safely across the train tracks, Elizabeth turned to me. Aren't you glad we went down there? She asked. Now we have Gordy right where we want him. I twisted a braid around one finger and looked up at the sky. It was blue and clear. You could see straight up through miles and miles of air. Maybe all the way to heaven if your eyes were only sharp enough to recognize it. Do you think our brothers wanted to go to war? I asked Elizabeth. Of course, she said. They're not cowards like Stuart. But what he said about the killing, do you think he's right? Don't be stupid, Margaret. The Nazis and the Japs want to take over the whole world. Look at all the people they've killed. Not just soldiers like Butch and Harold, but old men, women, children, little babies. We have to stop them. And if everybody acted like Stuart, Hitler would be in the White House right now. Is that what you want? No. I hate Hitler just as much as you do. Elizabeth stared at me. Well, then forget what Stuart said. He's a sissy, that's all. Sometimes you have to fight. You can't just let bad things happen. I shivered as a cold edge of wind worked its way down my neck. With all my heart, I wished Hitler was dead and that the war was over and my brother was safe at home. Then nobody would have to kill anybody else. Nobody would have to die. On Sunday afternoon, I was out in the backyard helping Mother hang out the laundry when Elizabeth showed up at my back gate with Gordy, Doug, and Toad. Gordy's wagon was piled high with boards, and Toad was carrying a coffee can full of nails. Where they found so much stuff was anybody's guess. I hoped they hadn't stolen it. Taking the clothespins out of her mouth, Mother smiled at Gordy. Well, well, she said, I haven't seen you since you used to tag along behind Stuart and Donald. If I'm not mistaken, they pulled you all over College Hill in that wagon when you were knee-high to a grasshopper. Doug and Toad laughed, and Gordy actually blushed. Unaware of his embarrassment, Mother went right on talking. Seems like yesterday all the boys were playing here in the backyard, she said. Jimmy, Joe, Donald, Stuart, Butch, Harold, and you, watching them from the wagon. Lord, how time flies. Mother focused on Gordy again, noticed his red face, and finally realized he wasn't the kind of boy who liked to be reminded he was once a little kid riding in a wagon. How are your brothers? She asked, to change the subject. Do you hear from them regularly? Gordy nodded. They're fine. Well, you be sure and tell Stuart how much I miss him. He was the best paper boy we ever had. No matter what the weather was, he never missed a day. Yes, ma'am, Gordy said. But it was me he was looking at, worried I might let the cat out of the bag, I suppose. Gordy's here to help Elizabeth and me build a new treehouse, I told Mother. Do you need me any more? No, we've gotten all the sheets up. All that's left is underwear, and I can manage that by myself. You run along, Margaret. And I did, as fast as I could, praying Gordy hadn't noticed the pink panties Mother was pegging to the line. Despite ourselves, Elizabeth and I were impressed at how quickly the boys nailed the platform together. Much as we hated to admit it, the new treehouse was bigger and better than the old one. When it was finished, all 5 of us had room to sit, legs dangling, eating the apples Mother brought out to us. So how long is Stuart going to hide over there? Elizabeth gestured with her apple at the woods. Till the war is over, Gordy mumbled. That could be a long, long time, Elizabeth said. We all nodded and swung our legs. Toad challenged Doug and Gordy to an apple spitting contest. Uninvited, Elizabeth joined in and won. It was very warm for December. The boys' jackets hung over the tree limbs, and Elizabeth's peacoat was unbuttoned. Her curls fluffed around her face as she turned to Gordy with more questions. Do you agree with Stuart, she asked, about killing being wrong no matter what? Hell no, Gordy said, daring anybody to tell him not to cuss. The only good Nazi's a dead Nazi, and that's true with the Japs, too. Stuart's got some crackpot ideas. And how come you're hiding him? Elizabeth wanted to know. Why don't you turn him in? He might be nuts, Gordy said, but he's my brother. Elizabeth swung her head toward Doug and Toad. What about you all? Stuart's not your brother. Don't you think it's wrong to hide a deserter? Toad shot a look at Gordy and shrugged. There is no way he'd go against his leader. Stu's a good guy, he said. A little dumb, maybe, but nice. If he doesn't want to go to war, it's okay with me. When Elizabeth turned to him, Doug frowned and shoved his hair out of his face. It might be against the law, he said, but I've known Stu a long time. I got no reason to turn him in. Doug paused and glared at Elizabeth through narrowed eyes. You got no reason either, he said. Stu never did anything to hurt you, did he? Hurt's got nothing to do with it, Elizabeth said. If you ask me, Stuart's scared of being killed, so he made up some highfalutin reason for not going to the war. Did you ever think of that? As she spoke, Elizabeth wisely put some distance between herself and Gordy. Stuart's no coward. Gordy leaned toward Elizabeth, his face red with anger. He's taken more than one beating from me. Elizabeth stared at him. Does your father beat you? She asked. Is that how you got that black eye? Shut up, Lizard. I'm sick of your stupid questions. Just mind your own beeswax and let me worry about my brother, okay? Grabbing a limb, Gordy swung out of the tree, and Toad and Doug followed him. Pulling the empty wagon behind them, they sauntered up the alley toward Dartmoor Avenue. Dumbo! Elizabeth shouted at them. The only response she got was a dirty gesture from Gordy. Turning to me, she said, I hate Gordy. If his father beats him, he probably deserves it. Maybe we should turn Stuart in after all." "Oh, no, Elizabeth," I said. "We promised not to. And besides," I added, "Gordy would kill us if we did, and you know it." Elizabeth frowned and buttoned her pea coat. The sun was resting on the treetops, getting ready to dive down into the dark, and I shivered as I zipped my jacket. "You're right," she said reluctantly. Then she grinned. "Well, at least we got a good treehouse out of them."